Good morning, students. Today we will be continuing on with the outbreak of the Cold War. If you remember when we last spoke, we already know that after World War II, the USA and the Soviet Union emerged as the two superpowers of the world. You also know that it was Stalin and the Red Army who had liberated Eastern Europe from Germany's control, which meant that the Red Army was stationed in Eastern Europe. Now, we also remember that Stalin at the Yalta Conference had actually agreed to having free elections to be held in Eastern Europe after the war. We all know that Stalin was not going to keep his word. With the Red Army that was stationed in Eastern Europe, Stalin actually had plans to expand his sphere of control into Eastern Europe. Now we also understood the point where Stalin was actually likely to create a buffer zone with Eastern Europe, and that would actually ensure that no foreign power could use Eastern Europe as a launch pad for future attacks against the Soviet Union. I recall showing you a map of Europe and how Soviet Union is actually surrounded by Eastern Europe. So in future, if any countries were to want to invade Soviet Union, they would have to go through Eastern Europe first. Now, while all this was going on, what was the USA thinking? The USA was actually suspicious of Soviet intentions in creating satellite states in Eastern Europe, and they believed, not wrongly, that the Soviet Union was planning to expand her control over the rest of Europe. Right? Examples of this happening, in France and Italy, there were communist parties that were actually growing in influence and actually growing in popularity among the people. Now, you might ask, Europe is geographically far from USA. So why was Europe important to the USA? Why was she not willing to just allow Europe to let things play out in Europe the way that they would have played out? Why did USA actually want to step in to intervene, in the political matters of Europe? Well, that's for two reasons. The first reason is an economic reason. And here, you will need to actually fill in your notes, with these 2 points, right? Now, so why was Europe important to USA economically? Eastern Europe and Europe in general actually had a lot of important resources that they were supplying and trading with the USA for. If Stalin had actually gotten control of Eastern Europe, and if he was left to his own devices, and if he actually managed to gain control of more of Europe, Stalin would actually cut off USA's access to the important resources, right? So this actually explains the point on how the Soviet Union was likely to prevent the USA from getting access to her traditional markets if it controlled the continent. So access to important resources for USA would actually be cut off. Not just economically, politically, Europe was also important to the USA. Now, why is that so? If the USA was forced to fight the Soviet Union, they would need a European base from which to attack the Soviet heartland Russia. And now, considering that Eastern Europe was likely to fall under Stalin's control, all the more that USA would need to establish herself as an ally to the rest of Europe, should she in future actually require a European ally to actually counter whatever Soviet Union was doing. Therefore, we actually see that the Soviet Union and the USA, they both had actually very strong national interests in exerting control over Europe, and this explains why Europe was a major area of Cold War conflict. Right, so a good point here to highlight would be the fact that they both countries, both superpowers, actually had strong national interest in exerting control over Europe. Alright, everybody doing good so far? Now, moving on, we have actually talked about ideology. I've actually mentioned about how communism is an ideology, how democracy is an ideology, but have you actually asked yourself, do you even know what is the definition of an ideology? Let me give you the definition. An ideology is just simply a group of ideas about how a society should be run. Okay, it is actually a set of beliefs. It is a system of beliefs, rather, a system of beliefs, a way of life that actually determine how people should behave, how people should react, how society should be run. Okay, now the examples given here, communism, Nazism, fascism, and democracy, these are actually political ideologies. Is ideology simply just limited to that of politics and governance? Is there no other form of ideology? Can you think of any other things or areas in your life where a certain set of beliefs actually influences the way that you act and think? Okay, take about 30 seconds. Think about this. Okay, do you subscribe to any sort of belief or any sort of rules and regulations, and this actually impacts your daily behavior? Now, if you actually answered yes to the question, and if you actually thought about religion, you are not wrong. Religion is also an ideology. So just simply think about it. Okay, what is religion? Religion is really a system of beliefs, okay, or provides us with a set of regulations as to how we should practice certain things in our life. Okay, so for example, okay, if you think about it, okay, the Muslims, right, part of their religion, okay, includes having to eat food that is halal. So just a simple belief like that actually influences and affects the way that they live their daily lives, does it not? Okay, so remember that religion is an example of an ideology as well. Okay, it is not just limited to the idea of politics. Now, what are really the differences between communism and democracy? So in the next part of your handout, okay, you will actually see that you have a table where you are to fill in the differences between communism and democracy. Okay, and there are a set of questions at the side to actually guide you to reach the answers. So, alright, now the first question. In each ideology, who controls the society? Alright, in communism, I think, okay, the only communist country that we have studied thus far would be Soviet Union, right? Okay, so if you recall when you did the chapter on Soviet Union back in Sec 3, okay, you know that the Communist Party and Stalin actually ruled the country. Okay, so Communist Party ruled the country. That is one big point, right? Only communist members can be in the government, and it is actually considered as a type of dictatorship, right? Modern communist countries today include countries like China, okay, countries like North Korea. So if you really just think about it, okay, in these two countries, okay, it's authoritarian kind of rule where there is only one party in charge and no opposition to political rule is actually allowed. On the other hand, in a democratic country, very much like Singapore, okay, the people, the citizens actually have a say as to who they want to rule the country. Okay, how is this done? Okay, through the use of elections and voting. Right? People selected who they want to rule the country by electing the people into the government. How should the people live? In a communist country, the belief is always community before self. The community needs should be prioritized above that of the people. Okay, and the individual should put the needs of the community before his own needs. So if you think back again, okay, on the idea of collectivization and industrialization in Soviet Union, right, you would recall that the people, right, the workers in the factories, the farmers on the collectivized farms, right, their welfare were not very much a priority of Stalin and the Soviet Union. Okay, in fact, Stalin was actually more concerned with having the targets that he had set for his 5-year plans met, rather than how the people actually felt about working in the factories and in the farms. Right, you will also remember about how, okay, under industrialization, the workers actually suffered from terrible working conditions. Okay, and how the farmers, they actually suffered from hunger and starvation because all their grain were taken away by the Red Army. Alright, okay, always the idea that the community needs is more important than that of the individual. On the other hand, in a democratic country, okay, the individual has rights, and some of these rights are more important than the community. Okay, very simple. Just think about one of the most liberal countries, USA, right? In USA, the individual's rights actually, some of the rights are actually more important than that of the community. For example, the freedom of expression, okay, freedom to vote, right? So in a democratic country, okay, the community should not restrict the self. There is freedom of speech, there is freedom of press, right? Censorship doesn't happen very often. The last question, okay, when we compare the two different ideologies, how should the wealth of the society be created and shared? So this actually talks about the economy of the country. Alright, in a communist country, wealth is owned collectively by everyone. If you remember, okay, one of the founding ideals of communism is the idea of equality, right? That no one is richer or poorer than the other. Okay, there's no social economic status, right? Whatever wealth is present belongs to everyone in theory. Okay, so the party here, referring to the Communist Party, creates this wealth by deciding on what to produce and how much to produce. This is known as the centrally planned economy, and that everyone should work and receive equal benefits. On the other hand, in a democratic country, wealth is created by private enterprise and trade. Okay, so this is basically the idea of private businesses. So who decides what is produced and how much to produce? It is not the government, but it is actually the businessmen and the entrepreneurs in the country who actually make these decisions. Okay, and already I'm sure you know, right, in a democratic country, okay, there is difference in SES, social economic status, right? Some individuals may be wealthier than the rest. Supporters of communism, okay, to them, the workers in a democratic society, okay, were the slaves of the farm, rich landowners, factory owners, and industrialists. But for supporters of democracy, okay, to them, the idea of choosing between democracy and communism is as good as making them choose between freedom and slavery. So they see communism as a form of slavery, right? They believe that communists had to accept the control of the Communist Party and give up all their freedom. Okay, so if you look at these two extracts of speeches by Stalin and Truman, okay, you will actually see, okay, how diverse their views are, right, between capitalism and communism. Okay, we are moving on to the very last part of this lecture notes. Okay, in terms of competing ideologies. Now, I have already mentioned to you that these competing ideologies did not simply pop up after World War II ended. Okay, these ideologies, it is very, very important to remember, okay, that the difference in ideologies had always been present. Okay, how far back? Well, think about it. As soon as Soviet Union was formed, right, under Lenin, as soon as communism was started in Soviet Union, therein lies the fact that the ideology of Soviet Union was already different from the West. Okay, right? So don't say that, never ever in a structured essay question say that competing ideologies is a reason for why the Cold War broke out. It is not. Okay, it is a underlying factor. Okay, you can actually say that it is an underlying factor, but it is not the reason why the Cold War actually broke out. Okay, don't ever forget that, right? Okay, so in terms of the political differences between communism and democracy, okay, you can actually see that how, right, this last part actually summarizes for you, okay, what happens, okay, in terms of whether or not there's a freedom of choosing who you want to govern you, okay, or whether or not, okay, who is more important, the self or that of society. Okay, right, so this actually brings me to the end of my podcast for this week's lesson. Okay, to summarize what I've actually talked to you about today, I have actually recapped with you, okay, and then I have also introduced the idea of ideology, and we have actually discussed the differences between communism and democracy. Now, this is not the end of today's lesson. Okay, I'm going to end today's lesson by sharing with you, okay, a video and from the infographic show. It's a 10-minute video, okay, about how the Cold War actually started. Now, it is a very, very informative, useful video, right? It actually summarizes for you in an entertaining way how the Cold War actually broke out. Okay, so once you're done with this podcast, okay, go back and watch the YouTube video and be ready to actually answer, okay, some questions that I will ask you regarding the video. If you have any questions, okay, you can always text me in the group WhatsApp, or you could always just drop me a text on WhatsApp. Okay, I'm always here to answer your questions, right? I hope that you have understood and you were actually able to follow along with today's lesson. I will see you again, or rather I will talk to you again, okay, next week. All right? Okay, thank you, class.